All right, folks are rolling in. We'll give it just a minute. Welcome. Happy Feeding Tube Awareness Week, everybody. Very cool. All right. Okay. As people are rolling in, I will just start with a brief introduction. Good morning. Thank you for joining us in celebrating Feeding Tube Awareness Week. This webinar, Mythbusters, Real Tips for Incorporating Real Food to Your Tube Feeding, is sponsored by Real Food Blends, as well as our whole celebration of Feeding Tube Awareness Week. In just a moment, I'll be handing things off to Victoria, who will share a bit about Real Food Blends and introduce our speakers. But before I do that, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We are utilizing the webinar format in Zoom, so things are simplified this time. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please try to utilize the Q&A function. Chat will be disabled just so everything goes to the same place and nobody gets missed. Oley staff, myself, and Andrea Taylor will be moderating those. And we'll use the last 10 minutes of the presentation to answer as many of your questions as we can. You can also use that space if you're having any technical issues or are looking for specific resources, and we will filter through those as well. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on our website for viewing later this week. And lastly, we will be having a Feeding Tube Awareness Week social hour focused solely on our enteral nutrition consumers, caregivers, and clinicians and corporate partners. So if you have any tips or tricks to share, questions you'd like to ask, stories you'd like to share, or you'd just like to meet other folks in the nutrition support community, that is a great place to do that. And you can find more information and register at oley.org/FT_awareness_week. So that's where you're going to find all of our Feeding Tube Awareness Week information, and as well as our social media channels. So with that, I will pass it off to Victoria. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Macy, and thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Victoria DiBiase, and I'm the medical manager for tube feeding at Nutrition North America. And I have very proudly been with Real Food Blends and the Real Food Blends team for over 6 years now. So if we move on to our next slide, for anyone who might be brand new to learning about Real Food Blends was founded by a family who has a tube-fed child named AJ. And when AJ's feeding tube was originally placed, he was trialed on many different formulas, and he kept experiencing signs of intolerance with each one. So that's when mom and dad decided to take matters into their own hands, and they started blending at home for him. AJ did so well with Real Food, he began tolerating his feed so much better that the family decided, let's take a trip to Disney World. And that family vacation was really the light bulb moment that led to the creation of Real Food Blends to help other families who are also looking for a convenient and ready to feed blenderized option for tube feeding. And to this day, AJ is still truly our chief inspiration officer behind our 100% real food meals for people with feeding tubes. And if we move on to our next slide, we're now very excited to be part of the Nutricia family of brands with an overall mission to bring health through food to as many people as possible. So now without further delay, I am very excited to introduce our speakers for today's event, Whitney Christie and Tamika Diaz. Whitney is an outpatient oncology dietitian and board certified specialist in oncology nutrition. She's also a certified nutrition support clinician, and in 2021, she received the Oncology Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group's Distinguished Practice Award. Whitney's been in practice for over 18 years now, and she works with patients who have feeding tubes every day. Whitney's seen the benefits of blenderized tube feeding firsthand in clinical practice, and she's very excited to speak with us about it today. And we're also joined by Tamika Simmons, a remarkable individual who wears many hats with grace and resilience. She's a full-time mother of three and a dedicated homeschool teacher as well. She's also the primary caregiver for her tube-fed daughter, Emily. Tamika strives to empower and to really uplift others who are facing similar challenges, offering guidance, support, and hope. And she does that through her advocacy work. So let's welcome Whitney, Tamika, and Emily's story very warmly to our webinar today. Whitney, the mic is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be asked to speak for the Oley Foundation and on this topic. It really is an exciting topic to speak on. We've come quite a long way with blenderized tube feedings. We're just showing some disclosures here for Tamika and myself. And then what are we going to talk about today? So today we're going to talk a little bit about common concerns about blended diets for tube feeding and dispelling myths about those, and then also understanding how to talk to your healthcare provider about real foods for tube feeding, which can sometimes be a challenging topic, and then tips for getting started with blenderized diets. And then Tamika is going to illustrate a family's experience, her experience with blenderized tube feedings, with a story told by herself. So what is blenderized tube feeding? So blenderized tube feeding is basically taking table foods in pureed or liquid form and using them through your feeding tube. This can be done in very different fashions. You can partially use blended whole foods with formula feeds, so it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can use this if you are on tube feeding formula. You can also have formula that has whole food ingredients that are added to them. There are also a variety of commercially prepared blenderized tube feed, as Victoria was describing with the Real Food Blends brand. And there's homemade blenderized tube feedings where people will take foods from their cupboards, from what they make, and recipes, and blend them together in a blender. There's also baby food-based recipes, and there's even a lot of new things out there. One that I've seen recently is there's powdered or dehydrated forms of blenderized tube feedings where you would add something like water to them. And like I said before, this can be done with most types of food, and you don't have to choose one form or the other. Sometimes it does, take a little bit of time to get into blenderized tube feedings, and there's many ways that you can be successful with your tube feeding journey. And I'm going to discuss with you some of the benefits and other things with blenderized tube feeding today. So a little bit about my a professional story about blenderized tube feeding. I thought it would be nice to share some stories of some patients that I've worked with. So I'm a cancer dietitian and I work at a community cancer center in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I have seen the benefits that whole tube feeding can provide to my patients and individuals who are undergoing intense cancer treatments. So one of the patients that I wanted to talk about was a patient who had head and neck cancer. And this was early in my career when I was kind of not very educated on blenderized tube feeding. I came from the hospital setting, and things are very driven by formulas in the hospital setting. So I had a patient who was going through cancer treatment, and he asked me, he had a feeding tube, and he asked me about blenderized tube feedings. And I felt kind of helpless. I didn't feel like I was helping him a lot during his journey because he just kind of took the lead and did his own thing. So after he completed his cancer treatment, he came to my office and he handed me a recipe book and told me that that was how he helped. It was a cancer cookbook, and that was what helped him with going through cancer treatment. So there's again, there's a variety of ways that you can use blenderized tube feeding. The other patient that I had was another head and neck cancer patient who had a feeding tube whose wife cared for him. And this just tells a little bit about the emotional bonding aspect of doing blenderized tube feeding. As as you can see on this picture here, it's a family setting where there's foods that are prepared. And a lot of times if you do have a feeding tube, you might not be able to eat these types of foods. When I called this patient for follow-up, his wife had shared with me that Thanksgiving had come and she felt, that he wasn't necessarily included in the meal because he had a feeding tube and was using it. So she said, I actually just took a bunch of the foods that we had from Thanksgiving and I threw it in a blender. Um, and I just thought that was a great story, again, to show kind of the emotional bonding part of this, the blenderized tube feedings. So here's some benefits of blenderized tube feeding, and there's a lot. And I have seen the benefits from the digestive standpoint. You can see there can be less gagging and retching. You can also have significant digestive improvements. So this kind of spans the whole spectrum. I mean, you can have changes with possibly constipation if you're having diarrhea. You also may have less nausea as well. Reflux too can be improved with blenderized tube feeding. So yeah, imagine being more comfortable on your feeding, and that actually helps you with eating more. So less oral aversion. And I have had patients who have had the desire to eat when they are on blenderized tube feedings more so um, than when they are on formula feeds. Going back up to the digestive part, the gut microbiome diversity, that's something that I think dietitians and others are kind of continually learning about every day. So that's just, adding, different colors, different types of foods to your diet, again, to give your gut microbiome that diversity. Weight gain can also be achieved through using blenderized tube feedings. And again, a lot of that comes from some of the improvements in tolerance with the tube feedings and some of the digestive improvements too. And then there's studies that are coming out that are showing less hospitalization in those individuals that are on blenderized tube feedings. The next piece of this is just additional benefits that can be offered by blenderized tube feeding. So more of a connection at mealtime and bonding. If you think about preparing foods, a lot of times that's how people show their love. So feeling more able to offer that love through the foods that you prepare, cooking and preparing those meals and blending them up. Emotional support is another thing that's listed here as a benefit offered. So offering real foods may provide emotional support if the tube feeder is unable to take normal foods by mouth. You don't necessarily feel like you're alone if you're at the table and having the other foods that other people are having too. Also, the control over food choices. A lot of times when we are ill, there is kind of a lack of control with various things, and having that control over the foods that you put in your body is another benefit of blenderized tube feeding. Participation in preparing meals. I think that's another nice thing that you can kind of get in there. And again, participate in the preparation, dietary diversity. So there's a variety of foods that you can use that are culturally appropriate and even a wide variety of colors of different types of foods. So I talk to my patients a lot in the survivorship, to my survivorship patients about some of the power in things like phytonutrients and different foods that help with preventing and fighting diseases. So that would be listed again under dietary diversity. And then also there's financial benefits. So nutritious blended meals can cost less per meal than specialized tube feeding, and that can result in savings. So a little bit about the history of tube feeding. So, and this kind of shows a little bit of, why we are where we are. Prior to the development of commercial formulas, many families actually used homemade blenderized tube feedings. And in many countries of the world, blenderized tube feeding is still a standard practice. Commercial formulas actually appeared in the 1950s, and then they increased in use in the 1970s. And we're using them a lot in the hospital setting because they're convenient. There was shown to be a lower risk of microbial contamination, which is important in a hospital setting because it's somewhat of a controlled setting. And they were also found to be nutritionally complete. But what we're seeing, I would say in the past 5 or 10 years is this cultural shift. And it's driven a lot by parents, caregivers, and we're seeing more people using blenderized tube feedings. And the industry is also responding, and there are more than a dozen type of blenderized tube feedings on the market. And as foods become more and more processed, I think a lot of people look to how they can add quality to their diet by adding things like wholesome foods. All right, so time to start doing some myth busting. I tried to list here things that I've heard from patients, throughout their journeys with blenderized tube feedings. The first thing is that blenderized tube feeding is hard. So just one thing about this, a lot of new things are hard to do, and with the right attitude, you definitely can. Sorry, I forgot to skip to this page. But yeah, with some meal planning and preparation, blenderized tube feeding can get a little bit easy, and anything can feel overwhelming. But just remember, as you go through, um, you can slowly transition. I mean, you can do these as slowly as you want to. I have had patients that are on full tube feeding formulas that may do things like they just add maybe a couple syringes of yogurt because they have some digestive issues. So again, you can transition to this very slowly if you like. Um, Blenderized tube feedings will not meet my nutritional needs. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard that, but I would say, it's advisable if you want to meet your nutritional needs. One thing you can do is to ask to a medical professional about it before starting on blenderized tube feedings. There's a lot of ways that we look at blenderized tube feeding and the adequacy that's provided in them nutritionally. There's different recipes that are out there. There's different food exchanges. There's plate methods where you can see if you're having that, again, the variety in your diet. You can have blood work done. And then there's also, various other ways to have a healthy diet that meets your nutritional needs on blended tube feeding. And then the next one is that blenderized tube feeding cannot be done with formula feeds. So this one, they can be done with formula feeds. Like I said before, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I have patients that might do half and half. I might have patients that might do one meal per day using the blenderized tube feeding. Sometimes it gets tricky when you're, getting supplies or getting them from either a durable medical equipment, a DME, or some type of infusion company, whoever you receive the product from. So you may want to talk again to a healthcare provider about that. Some people do have formula that they like to keep on hand, so they have that in their orders that their physician provides. And there are also, again, some commercially blenderized prepared feedings that you can also use too, and you can get those through, again, infusion companies, durable medical equipment, or your tube feed supplier. All right, blenderized tube feeding won't be covered by my insurance. This is not necessarily true. Again, it is helpful to speak to some key people and seeing if this is the case or not. You might have to there might be additional documentation or just additional information that your healthcare provider may need to submit. You can talk to your, again, DME or infusion company of different options. And you can speak with a dietitian. A lot of times there's dietitians in various settings. I mean, I work in the outpatient world with cancer patients. There's dietitians who work for these infusion companies and tube feeding supply companies. So you can speak with one of them if you are interested or have questions about your insurance coverage. Insurance is super complex. And again, there are a variety of commercial blenderized tube feeding products that are available through the companies. Sometimes there's different ones. That's one thing just to point out. Sometimes there can be different varieties at these companies that provide you with your tube feeding. And formula may also be included, and you may also be eligible to get both of those. The next one is one that I would say when I heard about blenderized tube feeding, there was a lot of talk about like clogging, and will it clog my feeding tube? So evidence is actually lacking on this, and it depends on what size of tube you have. Sometimes the particle size of the formula, we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then also flushing techniques. And one thing I want to add here is medications a lot of times can play a huge factor in clogging feeding tubes, and a lot of times they are the culprit. And then the last one is it's not safe for an immune compromised person. So the use of prepared blenderized tube feeding is considered safe if attention to proper food safety practices and proper hang times are followed. There's also other things to consider. So it's not necessarily, it could be inadequate cooking or cross-contamination that may cause issues with if there is any kind of contamination or foodborne illness. So again, remember it may not be the blenderized tube feeding. And again, if you're following proper food safety guidelines, you should be okay. This is a challenging topic to talk about, talking to your healthcare provider about real food for tube feeding. Again, this can be difficult because of the history of tube feeding. We talked about how in the hospital and the healthcare setting, a lot of things are formula driven. Some of your providers, I've heard patients say this, that they say they don't even know about blenderized tube feeding and don't really know how to offer advice on that. So I would say at least they're being honest about that. I would continue to try to have those conversations with different providers or again, some of the other sources. So maybe dietitians at, home care companies or your tube feeding provider. And healthcare is an ever-changing field. And we have really made huge strides on the blenderized tube feeding front. Like I said, in the past 5 to 10 years, I really cannot believe how far we've come with this topic. I feel like that I am always learning. I feel like I'm kind of a newbie here too, just always learning more about blenderized tube feeding. Um, I learn it from my patients. That's where a lot of the knowledge comes from. And then another thing just to point out is a lot of my presentation and some of the stuff you're going to see upcoming is actually from a paper that was released by the American Society of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition. They actually recently published their recommendations for blenderized tube feeding in the journal Nutrition in Clinical Practice. So that was big. And then this just goes over tips for getting started with blenderized tube feeding. Again, we've talked about talking to your physician or healthcare provider. So just get the conversation started and out there. Let them know why you're interested in adding real foods to your tube feeding and state why. Ask them for resources. And if you don't get the information back, ask if there's other people you can talk to. Are there dietitians you can talk to? And again, you can also talk to your an outpatient dietitian. You could call a hospital and see if they have any dietitians who work with individuals who have feeding tubes. You could also talk to your infusion company or your DME or durable medical equipment company. So those tube feeding provider companies. And then we're going to talk about some tips for getting started with blenderized tube feeding. So yeah, the basic elements that are needed here are time, equipment, skill, energy, the right attitude, resources to shop for food and to prepare and store blenderized tube feeding. So let's get started with talking about different types of blenderized tube feedings. We talked about like homemade versus commercial ones. So, and again, blenderized tube feeding is providing real food through your feeding tube. So for homemade formulas, they can be done on the spot and you throw the food in a blender and then you can use that as like a meal prep. Sometimes you're making maybe an evening dinner with that and then you just decide to throw everything in the blender and put it through whoever you're caring for their feeding tube or your own. Another cool thing I've seen is that individuals make large batches ahead of time and they use them in the future. So say, you might be like prepping on the weekend for the week and doing your blending. So tips for homemade blenderized tube feedings would be to consider having like airtight containers for freezing. You need freezer space too, and you need refrigerated space for thawing. Now, commercial products, again, these are formulas that are manufactured with food ingredients or pureed foods. So again, these have real foods in them, and they may or may not have added vitamins and minerals. I think that commercial products are great because they offer kind of that easy way and a convenient way to kind of start that blenderized tube feeding journey. So I have a lot of patients. I mean, a lot of my patients that go through cancer treatment do have issues with significant fatigue. So the thought of like getting out a blender and preparing things can be kind of daunting. So again, real food type of products can make it a little bit easier. Again, the commercial ones. You do need to have adequate space to store these products. So consider that having someplace, a dedicated space in your home to store the products. Um, and these products can also be a little bit more easily transportable, again, already made. And again, they may be a little bit easier than the homemade version. And also remember, again, that insurance is variable for commercial blenderized tube feeding. So again, talk with a healthcare provider, see if you need any additional information. You can also talk with your insurance company too. So again, there's a lot of avenues. And you can do both of these together. I mean, I have some patients that'll, do things where they throw them in the blender and then they also may use the commercial products too. So again, it doesn't have to be limited to one type, and you can also do formula with this. So tools needed for getting started with blenderized tube feeding. So this just talks a little bit about like feeding tubes and what size French you need for those. So a 14 French or larger is recommended. Although tubes that have a French size as small as a 10 have been used for blenderized tube feeding. A blender's obviously an important part of this too, and there's a variety of different types of blenders that you can see listed there. You can use a professional blender, you can use a jug, or you can use a wand type blender. Professional blenders are often stronger because they often will have a high powered motor and an extended warranty. So they may work better for those requiring blenderized tubing for a longer period of time. And Vitamix is what we would consider like the gold standard there. And typically for blending, you're going to need like 3 to 6 minutes of blending time, or you may have to do more if you need to decrease the particle size of the blend. And you can choose your choose your blender and your blend based on just different various needs. The next piece to this is the equipment needed. So I have learned a lot about this, again, throughout my years with working with individuals on blenderized tube feeding. As you can see there is a one of your piston syringes there. These syringes that are listed here, they typically may not work that well. Typically, the O-ring syringes are what I'm hearing from patients that work a little bit better because they don't stick. And some of these other plunger types, like the one that you see here, they may be kind of difficult after you used them a couple times. You may need to kind of like lubricate them with olive oil or butter to help with the pushing. So again, the O-ring syringes typically work a little bit better for blenderized tube feeding. And then as far as the administration sets, so there are gravity bags. Typically, large bore gravity bags work well for blenderized tube feeding, but there's also different products like reusable tube feeding pouches where you can mix some liquid in with your blenderized tube feeding and do your feeds that way. I have a lot of patients who also like those. They're kind of like shaker bottles. A lot of people are familiar with them, like with protein powders or drinks. They have like a circular wire whisk with them, and they use that to help with distributing the blend. So again, this is just some equipment information. And then tools needed. Obviously, some people are on tube feeding pumps. And just one thing to mention about tube feeding pumps is that blenderized tube feeding can impact pump performance and accuracy. So depending on the on your nutrition support, you might need to adjust the pump feeds. Sometimes too, people can come off of pump feedings when they're doing these, and depending on your kind of tube that you have and who you're working with as far as the healthcare professional, but you might be able to do some type of a bolus feed. So that's just something. Sometimes when you do blenderized tube feedings, the way that you give your feedings may change a little bit too. Um, And then a lot of people have button tubes. So just one tip for those, if you're considering going to blenderized tube feeding, see if you can get some straight bolus extension sets. And then this goes over a little bit about the hang time. So anytime you have a prepared blenderized tube feeding, it's going to be about a 2 hour hang time. And if you have commercial, the hang time for those, it varies depending on the product that you're using. And you want to discard any commercial product within 24 hours after opening. And in terms of storage of blenderized or prepared blenderized tube feedings, you want to make sure that you're freezing your product if you're using it, if you're going to use it in later. So you want to make sure you're freezing it within 24 hours of making it. So freezer temps, you want them to be lower than 0 degrees for optimum nutrient retention. And if you are storing your product in the refrigerator, it's best to discard it after 3 to 4 days if you aren't freezing it. Tube clogging. So this just goes over some of those foods that may increase the risk of tube clogging. So we have here things like white pasta, white rice, breads, muffins, bagels. There's also uncooked protein sources like meats, seafoods, beans, and legumes, eggs, and flax seeds. So those are products that can, again, increase the risk of tube clogging. And then and some more foods that may increase the risk of tube clogging, things like olives, stringy foods, so celery, string beans, fruits that have skin on them. And then some people actually sieve their blends. So one thing just to mention about this is it can actually take away some nutritional value. So it's really not advised to do this. It can take about as much as 50% of the nutritional value out of your blend. A lot of people will use sieves to remove unwanted seeds, stems, maybe some large things that are kind of floating around in their blend. Um, and there's different types of sieves that you can use too. One thing just to mention here is if you feel like your blend is like too thick, just remember, you may have to go above the 3 to 6 minute blending recommendation time to get it a little bit thinner and easy to flow through that feeding tube. Resources. So it's tough, getting on the internet and finding, various resources. There's two that I've listed here. The Choose My Plate. So that's basically what we kind of refer to as like the new nutrition pyramid, where it's a plate that's sectioned off into different sections where you have like your fruit, vegetable, grain, meat, and then dairy section as well. And again, that's just a plate model for showing, balance, variety in the diet and getting in all those different food groups. So that goes a little bit over the Choose My Plate. You can actually go on that website and it does give you information like if you're on like a 2,000 calorie diet, or you're aiming for a certain number of calories, it actually will list out for you how much you need from all the different food groups to get, that. And then Aspen also has a consumer guide for cancer patients. So that's another resource that's listed there. And just to talk about some common mistakes that happen, with blenderized tube feeding, typically some common mistakes are either inadequate or excessive fluid added to the blend. Sometimes people kind of overshoot it with the fruits and vegetables, so maybe too many fruits or vegetables, and then also inadequate carbohydrate or calories of the blend. When you are looking for resources, you want to make sure that you are choosing reputable sources. So just some information for that, some recommendations would be to use a site that's administered by a federal agency, a medical school, or a large professional or nonprofit organization. Websites should also provide information on who actually is reviewing the information or who the individual was who reviewed the information before they posted on their website. The date of information needs to be updated or reviewed, and it should also be easy to find if you're looking online for stuff. And then I would say avoid individuals' personal blogs or those with a featured opinion. I tell my patients, that you are unique and everyone's journey with tube feeding is unique. So again, sometimes there can be, avoiding some of those personal blogs or other like featured opinions can be helpful. So just some takeaways from this, blenderized tube feeding, it can be used as a supplement to formula feedings or as a primary source of nutrition. And then talk to your healthcare professional if you are considering changing to blenderized tube feedings. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I am actually going to turn it over to Tamika.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So happy Feeding Tube Awareness Week, everyone. Feeding Tube Awareness serves as an opportunity to celebrate the resilience and strength of individuals living with feeding tubes, as well as the caregivers who provide unwavering support and advocacy. It underscores the importance of access quality healthcare, nutritional support, and community resources for individuals and families navigating the tube feeding journey. So by coming together to recognize and honor the experiences of tube-fed individuals and their caregivers, we can work toward a more supportive and inclusive society for all. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited to be here to talk with you all today. Again, I'm Tamika, and a mother and homeschool teacher to three incredible girls. My days are very full. They are filled with love, learning, and laughter. We are busy. And beyond my roles within my families, I'm also a dedicated caregiver for my daughter, Evelyn, whose journey has inspired me to advocate passionately for children with rare diseases, as well as those with intellectual and physical disabilities. Through my experiences, I strive to foster understanding, support, and inclusivity for all children, empowering them to thrive, to reach their full potential. And it is an absolute pleasure to share a glimpse of my journey with you today. All right. So Emily's journey began in December of 2015. Filling my heart with anticipation of welcoming a healthy baby girl into the world. However, her arrival brought with it some unexpected revelation of a rare medical condition called anophthalmia. She was born without eyes. And while blindness initially seemed to be her primary challenge, little did I know that it would soon pale in comparison to the hurdles that we would face together. In April of 2016, our worlds were turned upside down when Evelyn was admitted to the hospital 3 hours away from home, battling heart failure. And during that time, a very harrowing 30-day hospitalization, there were moments where fear of losing Evelyn really gripped my heart. Amidst the uncertainty, Evelyn underwent numerous procedures during this time, and one of those was a placement of a G-tube. A procedure initially intended as temporary measure to aid in her heart's healing process. But what I didn't know was that the seemingly temporary solution would become a permanent fixture in Evelyn's life. Epilepsy would later emerge, robbing her the ability to eat by mouth, transforming the G-tube from a tool for recovery into a lifeline for sustenance. Understanding individual needs in tube feeding is paramount for ensuring the optimal health outcomes and quality of life for every patient. Each person's journey is unique, just like Whitney said. And with a feeding tube, there's several different factors that that are influenced, such as medical conditions, nutritional requirements, gastrointestinal function, and personal preferences. And embracing this diversity and tailoring care accordingly is essential for providing effective and compassionate support. By recognizing the individuality of each patient, healthcare providers can customize feeding regimens to meet specific nutritional goals and address underlying medical conditions. And to piggyback off of something that Whitney said, that's why it's important to find the right care team, the right care providing team. And that can come with a lot of challenges, but it's so optimal and so important. Understanding individual needs extend beyond the physiological aspects of tube feeding. It encompasses factors such as cultural background, lifestyle preferences, and emotional well-being. And when we take these factors into account, caregivers and healthcare professionals can create a supportive and empowering environment that honors the dignity and autonomy of each patient. We spoke earlier about how being a caregiver to a G-tube user encompasses both emotional and practical dimensions. And I won't go too heavy into those again, because Whitney did an amazing job covering a lot of those. But I do want to share that if you are experiencing the emotional roller coaster, the fear, the anxiety, the guilt, the sadness, it's completely normal and your feelings are valid. Witnessing a loved one struggle with medical procedures or health issues can be emotionally taxing. The demands of caregiving, including round-the-clock care, frequent medical appointments, managing complex needs, can lead to stress and burnout. And burnout is very real. Caregivers may experience feelings of grief, mourning the loss of a loved one's ability to eat orally, and lifestyle changes associated with tube feeding. As she mentioned earlier, there are a lot of us that show love by preparing foods, by feeding our families. And when something that we envision doesn't quite turn out that way, there can be grief and loss with that. Caregiving for a G-tube user can also be very isolating, as it may limit social activities and require a significant amount of time at home and in medical settings. So if you are a caregiver out there listening, this is your reminder to give yourself some grace. Caregivers are responsible for managing day-to-day aspects of tube feeding, administering feeds, monitoring hydration and nutrition, maintaining tube hygiene, planning, preparing blenderized meals, administering commercial formula. It requires such careful consideration of nutritional needs and food safety. We often serve as advocates for our loved ones as well in medical settings, ensuring that their needs are met, their voices are heard, and that their rights are respected. And of course, there's the financial strain. The cost of medical supplies, formula, and equipment associated with tube feeding can place a significant financial burden on caregivers and their families. Despite those challenges, being a caregiver to a G-tube user can also be deeply rewarding, fostering a sense of resilience, compassion, and unconditional love. Moreover, it offers opportunities for personal growth, deeper connections with loved ones, and a profound sense of purpose and making a difference in someone's life. I am someone who, again, food can be a love language for me. And as a health conscious caregiver, deeply committed to providing the best nutrition for my family, the decision-making process behind choosing blenderized meals for Everly was driven by my desire for optimal health and well-being. From the outset, I recognized the profound connection between food and health, believing firmly that food should nourish and assist with the healing process of the body rather than exacerbate medical conditions. When I was confronted with the prospect of using commercial formulas prescribed by doctors, I faced a dilemma. You see, when we started early in our journey back in 2016, when we thought that everything would be temporary, I didn't really have to worry about food for Everly during that time because I was a breastfeeding mom. So I knew that everything that she was getting was exactly what she needed. But as time went on, her needs were changing and they were different. And while these formulas were conventional and widely recommended, they often contained ingredients that didn't quite align with my family's dietary principles and often had an adverse effect on Everly's health. Witnessing her discomfort and illness after consuming these formulas reinforced my belief in the power of wholesome, real food as the ultimate source of nourishment. We think of how when we were younger, we were with a grandparent or an auntie or something, and we didn't quite feel good, and how they would take all of these different foods that had all of the minerals and vitamins and everything that we needed. More importantly, the love. Driven by this conviction, I initially embarked on the journey of blending my daughter's food myself. However, I quickly realized that the significant time, financial commitment, it was a lot. Despite my dedication, the demands of blending homemade meals became extremely overwhelming, threatening to compromise both Everly's nutrition and my own well-being. Because we all know that life just doesn't stop when this one thing happens. Discovering Real Food Blends was the turning point. It offered a solution that perfectly aligned with our values and priorities. And Real Food Blends provided the convenience and consistency that I needed without sacrificing the nutritional integrity of Everly's meals. With its carefully curated blends of whole foods, it offered a convenient and accessible way to provide my daughter with nutrition meals that supported her health and vitality. Whitney spoke earlier about how meals felt brought together, and I experienced that grief and that loss of her feeling it like she wasn't included during mealtime. And I loved so much how Real Food Blends had all of these different options. So when Thanksgiving came around and the family had turkey or chicken, there was options for Everly to be able to enjoy those type of foods as well. My decision to choose blenderized meals from Real Food Blends was rooted in a deep-seated commitment to holistic health and wellness. It allowed me to uphold my family's dietary principles while ensuring that Everly received the nourishment that she needed to thrive. Real Food Blends not only simplified the feeding process, but also reaffirmed my belief in the transformative power of food as medicine. So for caregivers out there new to the world of G-tubes, navigating this journey can feel overwhelming, but you're not alone. I'm going to share a couple of insights that I hope will help you along the way. Take time to learn about tube feeding, including all of the different ways to feed, including equipment involved, feeding techniques, potential complications. Knowledge really is power, and it will help you feel more confident in providing care for your loved one. Connect with other caregivers who have experience with G-tube feedings, whether it's support groups or online forums. Sometimes there's often local organizations that could provide valuable insights, tips, and emotional support that you'll need navigating this new territory. Be an advocate for your loved one's needs and preferences in the medical settings. Don't ever hesitate to ask questions or voice concerns and communicate openly with healthcare providers to ensure the best possible care. Understand that G-tube feeding may require adjustments and adaptations along the way. Be flexible and have an open mind and an open heart to trying different feeding methods, different formulas, different schedules to figure out what works best for your loved one personally. And I know that some of you who may feel overwhelmed on this journey right now might give me an eye roll to the next one. But it is so important to remember to take care of yourself. Yes, you also, in the middle of everything else, need to take care of yourself too, amidst the demands of caregiving. Prioritize self-care activities. Seek respite when needed. Ask for help from friends and family and professional caregivers. It's so important for you and for your loved one that you're also taking care of yourself. Don't forget to celebrate the small victories and milestones along the way, whether it's successfully administering a feed or noticing improvements in your loved one's health. Everly suffered severely from reflux, and we would go from extreme diarrhea or extreme constipation. It was always, one extreme or the other. And there was so much time and patience, frustration, love, but also a lot of care that went into figuring out what works for her. And these moments are worth celebrating and cherishing and can provide much needed encouragement during those challenging times. Above all, trust your instincts, trust the love, trust the dedication that you bring to your role. With time and patience and support, you'll find your rhythm. You'll feel more confident in providing care for your loved ones. Advocating for individualized care is paramount in ensuring the well-being and quality of life for individuals with unique medical needs. And by recognizing and addressing the specific needs and circumstances of each individual, we can tailor care plans that truly meet their holistic needs. Individualized care goes far beyond a one-size-fits-all approach, acknowledging the diverse backgrounds, experiences, and challenges that individuals may face. It also involves actively listening to concerns, preferences, and goals, incorporating these into care decisions. When we advocate for individualized care, we empower the individuals to play an active role in their own healthcare journey, fostering a sense of autonomy, which is really important, dignity, and empowerment. This approach not only improves the health outcome, but also enhances the overall experience of care, promoting trust and collaboration and satisfaction between patients and healthcare providers. It's about honoring the uniqueness of each individual, reaching their inherent worth and dignity. It's a fundamental aspect of person-centered care that prioritizes respect, compassion, and empathy, ensuring that every individual receives the care that they need to thrive. Finding providers who understand the importance of individualized care was a pivotal moment in Everly's journey. As her healthcare professionals tailored her care for her unique needs, her energy surged, developmental inchstones were reached, and the diagnosis of failure to thrive was eventually removed from her list of diagnoses. We all know that that is a huge deal. She really became a whole nother person. She began to meet physical inchstones that seemed impossible. This personalized approach not only transformed her health, but also empowered her to thrive beyond expectations. I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to share my story. Being able to share our experiences, our challenges, our triumphs, not only allows us to connect with others, but also serves as an inspirational support for those navigating on similar journeys. So I'm thankful today for this platform provided by Oley Foundation, Feed Tube Awareness Week, Real Food Blends, which allows us to raise awareness so that we can all have a better understanding, so that we can all better advocate for individuals and families affected by tube feeding. And your willingness to listen and engage with our stories reinforces the importance of community, empathy, and solidarity in facing life's challenges. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for allowing me to share my journey and for being part of this very supportive and compassionate community.
Thank you, Tamika and Whitney. Oh, we enjoyed both of your presentations. So we have some really great questions from the attendees. So one of the questions is, So if a patient is on, or if someone is on blended tube feed at home and they get admitted to the hospital and aren't able to use their blended tube feeds, what would you recommend they use instead?
If they're not able to use their blended food tube feeds in the hospital, there are other options that you can have that makes it a bit easier during hospital stays. Like Whitney said, there are some that are powdered formulas. Um, I personally would recommend exploring options for each scenario initially. That was very helpful for me, and it helps decrease your stress levels during those hospital stays. Because during those times, there's so many things that we're having to worry about and focus on. And the last thing we want or need is to try to figure out how we're going to feed them and how their bodies are going to respond to that. So I would recommend during a time where things, are good, that you explore different options and different options when it comes down to different types of food, because the powder is definitely a lot more easier and convenient during those times. It's the powder, you add water, you add whatever vitamins or minerals that you choose to add to it, and it goes through the feed perfectly.
Great, thank you.
A
Whitney,
lot of my
anything?
patients, yeah, a lot of my patients actually take their the commercial blends in and, get permission to do those in the hospital.
I
So,
have
I mean,
also done that as well. Sometimes though, depending on the stay or while you're there, can can play a huge role. Can play a huge role. And like I said, the stress and overwhelm of that, if it's a scheduled stay, yeah, we take our own stuff. But in more emergent situations, sometimes you have to move a little different.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, awesome. Whitney, this question's probably for you. Um, so a head and neck cancer survivor trying to gain weight, do you have any suggestions for foods that they can incorporate to help gain weight? They're using organic, vegan, real food tube feeding.
Yeah, I mean, usually what I would do is if I had a patient that was trying to gain weight, I would probably, go over all the different foods that they're having in their blends. And I mean, if you want to gain weight, typically it is high calorie, high protein type of diet. So, maximizing, the calories that you're taking in, whether it be, changing like the milk that you're doing from like skim or low fat to like a high fat product, also trying to put nutrient dense foods into your blend. So those are just a couple of suggestions that I would offer. There's also some stuff that says if you do, real foods through your feeding tube, you actually might require a little bit more as far as calories, just because of the whole process of digestion with real foods. So that's another thing too, is you may require a little bit more calories if you're doing something like blended foods. So yeah, again, high calorie, high protein. If you're able to kind of track how many calories that you're getting, maybe working with a dietitian would be suggested. I know a lot of times it is really hard after you get done with that head and neck cancer treatment. And I mean, there's a lot of people out there that are living with feeding tubes after, they get through all of their treatments. So, another suggestion may be when you go to your provider for a follow-up, maybe ask if there's a dietitian that you can speak to so that they could maybe assess what you're doing through your feeding tube.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So how about blenderized tube feedings using a J tube?
So I've done it before. I would say, there's no decision or recommendation, even in those um, even the new recommendations that Aspen put out. I've had several patients use it through a J tube. Sometimes it can help, again, from the digestive standpoint. I haven't got in my personal experience, I've had some challenges from the weight gain perspective with some blenderized tube feedings through the J tube. So I would say again, I'm a kind of a newbie with the J tubes. And again, there's no recommendation, on doing or not doing them. What I've seen as far as recommendations is it is up to the nutrition professional that you're working with.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to try to summarize this question. So it looks like they're wondering if a person is NPO and not taking any food by mouth that would stimulate enzyme production, do they need to worry about supplementing with any synthetic enzymes?
That would depend on your medical condition. So,
That's what I was
yeah,
going
it
to say too.
definitely would can it depend on like what you've got going on as far as, I mean, a lot of those enzyme questions are more related to kind of your digestive function or your pancreas, and different
Yeah,
things. So
that would
that's
be
pretty
a great,
complex. Yeah.
great conversation to have with the GI.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Tamika.
Well, I was going to share that would be my recommendation. My recommendation would be to discuss that with a GI. Everly has gone through so many different just figuring out, like you said, those healthy levels, the whether it's enzymes or acid, and because everybody's journey is their own, I highly recommend finding a GI that you love and trust to work through that, because that can be a bit of a process, like pinpointing it down to the exact needs, but well worth it. Well worth it.
Awesome. Thank you. Any good resources or strategies for vegan tube feeders who want to do blenderized foods?
I
Whitney?
don't necessarily have any. I know the American Dietetic Association has some information for vegetarians and vegans, but no, not necessarily any great resources or anything like that. Um,
Yeah, that would be for me personally, that would be another like follow your instinct um type thing. We've done vegan diets very early on when Evely was still breastfeeding, actually, because of how she would respond to the milk when I would eat certain foods. I ended up just doing a complete vegan diet while breastfeeding her, because it was more gentle on her stomach during that time. And after, when coming out of that, going into solids, um, I used to do the same thing. And during that time, just to make sure certain things were incorporated into her diet, I would add avocado to almost everything that she had, just for, certain fats and stuff. When you're having a child that's failure to thrive, she was very small for a very long time. And but there's vegetarian and vegan options out there as well.
Perfect. Thank you. So questions come up about insurance. Do you have any resources as far as how to get home like blended tube feeding covered by insurance?
you have to work with someone.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I'm kind of the in between with my patients.
Yeah.
So sometimes the conversation's brought up before, during, or even after treatment. And again, insurances, I mean, sometimes even from year to year, they can change what they cover and they don't
Yep.
change. So I think it's good to, again, kind of establish yourself or find a good resource that you can talk to in the company that's providing your tube feedings, because they're
Yeah.
going to know. I mean, I work with a dietitian at these companies, and, I'll just ask, like, what products would you cover? This patient's interested
Mhm.
in doing blenderized tube feedings. What can we do to help them, get there, or what products do you cover? Because it can even vary by different infusion
Yeah.
companies. Yeah. So
Some
sometimes they
DMEs
carry a
can
certain
carry
brand.
different things.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
So
yeah.
if you found something that you loved beforehand, which is what happened to us, I found real food blends before having conversations, and then went to it and said, okay, well, at the time, the DME that we had did not cover or could not provide real food blends. But I knew that's what I wanted for Everly. So so I just basically, called around to DMEs that service our area until I found the DME that said, "Oh yeah, we can get real food blends for you." So sometimes it's just a matter of talking to people, talking to the DME, talking to dietitian. Like Whitney said, dietitians, they are the really good ones are going to going to be able to tell you exactly where to go for what.
Right. Okay.
And there's
Now we,
there's free samples too you can get too. That's one thing that I do for my patients kind of as a segue before, going to the DME or infusion company. There's samples that these companies provide where a healthcare provider can actually, they send them to your house. So it's a nice way again to kind of get you into,
Yeah.
using more of the blenderized tube feedings and also kind of exploring, what different options are out there. And then from there, you can kind of, figure out which companies might have them. I have actually changed patients from kind of like Tamika said, she found, who had real food blends. I've changed patients to different companies because they don't have the product at one that they might have at another. So it can be a little bit challenging, but yeah, definitely having a great healthcare professional or resources can be helpful.
okay. Okay, great. Well, and we have quite a few other questions, but I'm thinking maybe we can send them to the both of you afterwards, get them answered, and then we can send them to our attendees. Um, I don't know, Maisie, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I mean, people are welcome to hop off if they have to. Thank you so much for attending. And just a reminder, we do have our social hour at 6 p.m. this Friday, and you can register for that on our Feeding Tube Awareness Week website, which I have put in the chat. I'm not sure if it went through, but you'll get it in a follow-up email as well. Yeah, I think if you guys are okay, we can answer one more and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, perfect. So one person had a question, what's the process when using blenderized tube feeding that has previously been frozen?
That's previously been frozen. So there are some USDA guidelines that are out there. So it's kind of like normal. I mean, a lot of this is comparable to just normal eating. So if you have, like meats in the blend, it will say there are USDA guidelines that are out there about how long that those products are good to be kept in the freezer. So that's what I would say is try to follow those. I don't have them like right now available, but that is the resource that you would use for keeping things or for, checking about when things kind of expire or not at their best, use by date.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, well then I'll turn things back over to Maisie.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your expertise with us. And thank you once again to Real Food Blends for sponsoring this webinar, as well as our celebration of Feeding Tube Awareness Week. Check out our website, oley.org, for more upcoming events. And enjoy the rest of your Feeding Tube Awareness Week. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to email info@oley.org, and we'll try to get some answers passed along to you. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.